Hello everyone. I'm going to redo the talk I gave at Mila yesterday at the reading group, and I'm going to talk about this paper in specific and also about modeling the brain and this research area in general. By the end of this presentation, I hope you'll be better at answering basic neuroscience. Why is modeling the brain so hard? Why backpropagation is not biologically plausible? And how the brain may be doing credit assignment. So let's start with some basic neuroscience first. Neuron is the most basic element in the brain and it communicates through spikes. It has dendrites where it gets its input from the previous neurons. It has a cell body or soma where the neural impulse gets started, and it travels along the axon into the axon terminal where it is connected to the next neuron through a synapse. So this is how a synapse looks like. We're not going to get into the cellular process behind how the synapse gets communicate how the signal gets communicated, but uh, there's this idea called synaptic plasticity. It is that the ability of synapses to get stronger or weaker over time. So based on some metric, these synapses either get stronger or weaker, and this ability to uh, change your synaptic strengths, people believe that to be the reason for learning and memory. So all your memories and learning are stored in these synapses in your brain. And if this is the human brain, neocortex makes up most of the outer layer of the brain where most compute happens, and majority of excitatory neurons in the neocortex are pyramidal neurons. So the big picture: deep learning has high performance and similar representation as the neocortex in humans. Deep learning is just multi-layered networks, and for learning in multi-layered networks, you need credit assignment. So credit assignment is the idea that you assign credit or blame to each neuron or a connection based on its contribution to the loss function. AI researchers solve it using backpropagation, but that is not biologically realistic. So the brain must be doing something else. So the goal of this research area is to figure out the brain's learning algorithm that will help us understand the biological basis of intelligence and build better learning architectures. And this paper is a very specific argument on how pyramidal neurons in the brain may be involved in credit assignment. So let's take a step back and think. How should we model the brain? The brute force approach would be to build a model of the neuron and build a model of interaction between neurons, observe connections in the brain, and then replicate the same and simulate. The problems with this are that it's hard to get the perfect model of neurons and the connections between them because they're generally very noisy, and even doing a high risk scan and getting their interconnections is hard. But let's say we have access to perfect models and all the interconnections. The problem here is that there are 86 billion neurons of varying types and also 7,000 connections. We just don't have that kind of compute to run such a simulation. So the solution is to make some simplifying assumptions. So one assumption that we can do is building it at a higher abstraction level. So there are multiple levels of abstraction at which we can model a physical system. We can model every atom or molecule. We can go to the neuron level. We can go to the population of neuron level, or modeling the whole brain. So at the population of neurons level, the basic unit in your simulation would be a population of neuron. So the advantage of going higher up this hierarchy and building at a higher abstraction level is that you save more compute. Because if you're modeling every atom, there are just too many units, and modeling the interactions would be very computationally intensive because there are too many smallest units. The Human Brain Project is trying to build the whole brain level model using using population of neurons as the basic unit. Jeff Hinton is not a fan of the project. He says that the real problem with a project like that is they have no clue how to get such a large system to learn. Another simplifying assumption is to model just specific pathways instead of the whole brain. So this is how the vision pathway is in the brain. The light hits your retina, it goes to LGN and then V1 and then higher layers of your brain. And there are also a lot of feedback connections. And another assumption is to assume that the input is constant and it's not changing over time. And we can relax these assumptions later to build a more general model, but this is a good starting point. And I'm going to cover one such attempt in this talk. So what are the assumptions that we are making to build this very simple model of how the brain learns? Assumption number one is that synaptic plasticity is responsible for learning and memory in the brain. This is a widely accepted assumption in neuroscience, and as we go down the assumptions, they're going to be less and less widespread. Assumption number two is that the brain optimizes loss function. This has been argued for in this paper, and I'm not going to go into those details now. Assumption number three is that the brain needs to solve credit assignment. So based on this loss function, it has to change the weights on the synapses based on the contribution of the synapse to the loss function. Assumption number four is that brain uses some variation of gradient information to learn. And this seems like we are taking a leap in faith. I've heard Blake Richards argue about this, and he was saying that for any hierarchical multilayer network, the most efficient way to learn right now is gradient algorithms. Without a gradient, it's just not easy to learn in such a network. And he's making a parsimonious assumption saying the brain must also be doing the same. And he's also open to the possibility that if we one day figure out a much more efficient way of learning without using gradients, then sure, this assumption wouldn't hold anymore. Assumption number five is that pyramidal neurons help in separating forward and back prop. We'll get into the details of this, so don't worry about it now. And let's say we have some assumptions and we build a model. How do we verify that it is accurately representing the brain? Having high performance is not good enough. It should also be able to make good experimental predictions that we can actually test on a human brain. So how does the brain solve credit assignment? The obvious solution, which is not biologically plausible yet, is backprop. And this is the formula for backprop. You can pause the video and take a closer look at the math. But basically what happens is the weight change that you have at this synapse depends on the transpose of weights on the following synapses and also on the error term. The problem is that there's no reason to assume that this synapse would have access to W1 or the error term. And for doing backprop, we need those values. So there are several problems with just using backprop. And problem one is not having access to error term. Problem two is not having weight symmetry, which is the value of W1 transpose when you're propagating through the chain rule. And we don't do separate backward and forward passes. I'm sorry, it's hard to do separate forward and backward passes in the brain, and we'll go into the specifics of these later. So there has been some work for solving each of these problems. So the present paper of this talk argues for this, but let's go through all of them and slowly knock each one out. So error term. The claim here is that nudges are biologically plausible. There's no reason to assume that the loss function is explicitly represented in the brain. For example, when you're learning to speak, it's not like your brain is forming a target of what you said and comparing it to a value of what your parents said, doing a subtraction between them and then using it. So even though you don't have an explicit comparison, there is probably something that is pushing you towards the right answer. And I think this seems like something that is common in bio-inspired AI research. Uh, for example, this paper by Skiller and Bengio propose a biologically plausible model called equilibrium propagation, where they don't have the error term explicitly, but they only have nudges. So they have a free face with no external feedback and a weakly clamped face where the environment occasionally nudges it in the right direction. So problem number two, weight symmetry, not having access to the W1 transpose. So the claim here is that the exact value doesn't matter. We only have to go roughly in the direction of gradient. Let's take a very specific example. This is the contour plot of a loss function. Let's say this is W1 and this is W2. If you go perfectly in the direction of gradient, you would end up at the optimal. And that is case one. Another case is where you're not going in the direction of gradient, but you have the right direction in both the dimensions. Um, then you still eventually end up at the optimal. So we only need correct direction along each dimension. So backprop assumes that we have access to W1 transpose, and Timothy Lillicrap at a Deep Mind had an idea that is there a way to figure out or learn these W1 transpose weights, and he was running a control case for it where he fed back random weights, and he was trying to see how the control case would perform. And it turns out that surprisingly, the control case was already performing quite well. The reason is because these weights W naught realign themselves based on this B so that the net gradient is effectively pointed in the right direction. Yeah, and there's this plot of the difference in the angular difference between what you get through backprop and what you get when you use a random weight matrix, and it's about 40 degrees, which leads to just as fast convergence. And this has been studied further, and uh, they say that the magnitude of W1 doesn't matter, only the weights do, only the signs do. But yeah, I think this is still a an active research question. The problem with this is that it doesn't work with deeper networks because alignment becomes harder. So assume that you have like 100 layers and you're updating the weight at layer one, and you don't have access to the next 99 layers weights. It's very hard to align the whole gradient based on just these layer one weights because we are right now in a very high dimensional space. So it understandably gets harder. Um, Blake argues that the solution may be causal inference, and it is explained more in this video. I won't be getting into the details here. Issue number three, separate forward and backward passes. So in a typical neural network, we do a forward pass, calculate the error, and use that error to do a backward pass. We do this separately. So in the brain, if we assume uh, a typical neuron, the problem with let's say we have feedback connections, and let's say the credit information is going through the feedback connections. The problem here is that there must be a way for the neuron to differentiate between credit related info and the feed forward info, because in general you update your synaptic weights based on your credit information and not the feed forward information. So there must be a way to differentiate these two. And that is something we assume. This is again a parsimonious assumption, because if the feedback values and the feed forward values, uh, if the neuron can't differentiate between them, um, the way we don't know of any algorithms that can still disentangle them and still learn. And when we look at the brain activity, when we see something, it's not like we see a sweep of forward activity and then something happens and then we see a sweep of backward activity. The brain is always active. So the claim here is that the nonlinear properties of dendrites of pyramidal neurons make this possible. So this is the background again, and to just re-summarize it, neocortex makes up most of the outer layer of the brain, and pyramidal neurons are the most common excitatory neuron in the neocortex. So let's go into the architecture of the anatomy of pyramidal neurons. Pyramidal neurons generally look like this. If this is your brain surface, you have multiple layers. Your cell body is located in layer 5, and then you have a set of dendrites around your cell body. And surprisingly, you also have dendrites up in layer 1. So this cell seems to have two sources of input, one at layer 1 and one at layer 5. And neuroanatomically, we know that most of the synapses in the dendrites for layer 5 come from the bottom up sensory information, and most of the synapses are coming for apical dendrites from the top down feedback. And this is a cool microscopic image of the same, and you can see the cell body here. These are the first set of dendrites called basal dendrites, and these are the second set called apical dendrites. And this is the axon. So this is the primary hypothesis of the paper. Pyramidal neurons simultaneously communicate bottom-up information through basal dendrites and top-down information through apical dendrites. Here are some key but not all insights. I just covered the ones which I found more interesting in more detail. So typical neural network models have just one output, but evidence suggests that pyramidal neurons have two outputs. So it has just one output, but it's communicating information regarding two signals. So it is that claim is backed up by this experiment. This is a biophysical simulation of a population of neurons, and you feed input at your soma, and you can feed input at your apical dendrites. You keep changing these inputs and see how the cell is firing and try to figure out the properties of this ensemble of neurons. And right now we're modeling at the level of an ensemble, and we're not modeling each neuron separately. So we'll need a few definitions before we start. A burst is continual firing, so it looks something like this. A spike is firing once, so it looks something like this. An event is either a burst or a spike. So when you keep changing inputs to your soma and dendrites, and you see how your firing rate changes, the average firing rate of the whole ensemble, it turns out that you don't see anything. It seems to be encoding none of this information. But instead of looking at the average firing rate of all the cells, you look at the event rate, which is how many neurons in the ensemble engaged in an event. Then it seems to be conserving the information that you get at your soma. And if you look at the burst probability, which is the number of events which are burst, it seems to be conserving information that you're getting at your dendritic inputs. So this is quite interesting, because this cell firing of this ensemble seems to be encoding both the inputs at its dendrites and soma. Claim number 2 is that traditional Hebbian rule is insufficient to explain. We need a new rule. So traditionally, uh, synaptic plasticity is explained through Hebb's law. And this is very rough and inaccurate summary of what Hebb's law does. If you're a non-neuro background, then I think this is an okay place to start. The idea is that neurons that fire together wire together. So your synaptic plasticity gets higher if there is strong correlation between your pre and post synaptic firing. And the same is represented here. This is the event rate of your post neuron, and this is the event rate of your pre neuron, and your weight change will be dependent on that. But new evidence, especially in pyramidal neurons, suggests that there is a new factor that regulates the sign of plasticity change. So the argument here is that there is an additional term which is the burst probability. P of t is the burst probability minus a baseline, but let's ignore that for now. The idea here is that the burst probability is influencing how you learn. It's regulating how you learn. So previously the burst probability was encoding your dendritic input, which we were thinking was top-down credit related information. So this is an argument on how your top-down credit related information is affecting how you learn. And this is an experiment that gives you evidence for this formula. So you intentionally simulate either bursts or spikes at your soma. So it turns out that when you simulate a spike, your synaptic plasticity reduces. So this is the strength of your connection to the following neuron. And when you simulate a burst, the synaptic plasticity increases. So this formula seems so I'm abstracting out one layer of explanation here. This is an average over ensemble, and here we are looking at a single cell. There's a formula for this, and from there we have to do some derivation to get here, but I'm abstracting all that out. The idea here is that your credit related information can modulate how your network learns. And claim number 3 is that the properties of apical dendrites make them suitable for credit assignment. One of those properties is the bottom-up sensory information is connected here and top-down feedback comes here. So it kind of seems like the credit information would have to come here. And there are some more properties considering an ensemble of neurons, and I'm not getting into that. And the paper uses very conservative language. They say we still have many unanswered questions, and we need more investigations to really figure out if this is happening or not. Okay, you've made enough claims. Many of you would be thinking, can you show me a network that actually works? This is brilliantly explained in this video, so I'm not going to go into the details. I'll just lay out a rough overview for you. So overview, we first build a model for ensemble of pyramidal neurons. Then we model interactions between them and derive some learning rules and put all of them in a hierarchical architecture and train. And this is how something like that would look like. I'm intentionally skipping the math here. I just want to show you the results. And these are the results. So again, there are a few tricks here that I'm skipping out. One of them is you use a convolution layer in between. While convolutions are biologically plausible, we still don't know the mechanism through which credit related information can go through convolutions and we can learn the filter values. So I'm just skipping out some information here, but the idea is that uh, the red line is a traditional CNN with no tricks, and this bluish line is the bio inspired architecture. And both of them have the same number of hidden layers and hidden units. And on MNIST, they perform almost equally well. And the same is the case with CFA10. And the good thing about this is it also generates experimental predictions that we can actually test in the lab. So there is a way to figure out if what we are learning is correct or not. So the next natural question to ask is, how do we scale this up to ImageNet? Apparently, these units are not scalable on the GPU, so when you want to train a network with a million parameters, it is not that easy. But Blake's lab seems to be working on ways to solve that issue. And I hope I've answered these questions to some extent, and you can get in touch with me here. I hope you liked it. Bye.